Good day and welcome. My name is Aleksandra and today I will be bringing you my April wrap-up and May and June TBR. I will do a bi-monthly TBR this time because I don't want to pin myself to certain books in a certain month, but 2 months might just work. But first we start off with my April TBR. It was not so good of a reading month for me because I ended up in a reading slump, which made me not participate in Tome Topple altogether. I only did start one of the Tome Topple books last month, and I will show you which one later on. But first we start with the wrap-up of the 2 books I read in April. The first one is Uprooted by Naomi Novik. I started it in the last couple of days of Tome Topple in a hope it would get me out of a reading slump, and it absolutely did. This retelling, I gave it 4 stars, I believe, because it has a lot of problems. And I won't deny them, but I still really enjoyed the book just for the sheer fact that it is a fun retelling in the new adult setting. But, well, it's not the best story, it's quite a cheesy book. I altogether liked it despite the lack in character and maybe even world building. I still liked the world, I liked the story, I liked the darkness of it. And the Beauty and the Beast vibe it has, but also it has a retelling of, I believe, Agnieszka and the Horse or something. I believe it was a Polish fairy tale, and you get like a little bit of that at the end of the book with the yellow cow. I found that very interesting and very nice to see, and I'm curious to that fairy tale, but I have no clue where to find it. The second and final book I finished in April was The Last One by Aleksandra Oliva. This is a book set in a reality television show, and that television show has as a basis survival, which I found a really interesting really plot idea. You also get the influence of like the digital world on forums and stuff throughout this book. The influence it has on our lives and on our perception of television shows. But this book turns darker without you even noticing it, and I was in part... This was the first book ever. This is supposed to be a thriller and suspense novel, and I was wondering what was happening. But I also got a very strong sense that one of the characters that appears in here is right from the moment he enters. And I'm not going to tell you if my feeling was right or not, but I got a very strong sense of that. And yeah, I found it very well written. Apparently it also has some messages in it about healthy and organic eating, but since the brands were more or less American and I live in Europe, I did not notice it in the slightest. But until now, this is my favorite book I finished this year. I gave it a 5 star because it let me think so much and it left an impression on me. And I sometimes still think about this until this day. But this book is very close, followed up as a year favorite, I think, by the next book I'm going to mention. I only just started it last month, I did not finish it, and it was one of the books I wanted to read for Tome Topple. And that book is Raymond E. Feist's Magician. As you can see, I'm like halfway through this book. It has more than 800 pages, and it's the story of Pug and his friend, Thomas, when a war starts happening, the Rift War, rifts are opening in this world, and people from I think a parallel world are entering Mid-Chemia, which is the world this book takes mostly place in. And of course the Mid-Chemians have no clue what is happening because it is magic they do not understand. And yeah, we see what's happening from the moment when Pug becomes an apprentice to the court magician. he did not even know he had a feeling for magic in the first place, and he doesn't understand what's happening when he starts learning. And you follow his also his travels during the war and what happens with him during the war, and also with his friend and just the general populace. And it is very interesting to read. This might become one of my all-time favorite fantasies. I haven't decided yet, and I also haven't finished this. And this is only the first book in a trilogy. The second book I want to read in the upcoming 2 months is Authority. I want to finish this. I'm actually also halfway through this. The bookmark is not very clear, but I'm here in the book. It's a little bit more than halfway through, and this is the second book in the Southern Reach trilogy. So I'm not going to tell you a lot, even though the story follows a very different perspective as the first book in the trilogy. But what happens is a follow-through on what happens in the first book. It's very interesting. I have a feeling that I read somewhere it's supposed to be a thriller series, but it feels more like a mystery. It has a mystery vibe to it and also a psychological vibe, but I'm not sure what I feel about this. It's written in a very likable writing style, but I have a feeling that this contains a lot of information that might not be necessarily necessary, but we will see when I finish the book. Now we go on with the books I want to read the upcoming 2 months that I have not yet started. The first one is this poetry book. It's called Motherland, Fatherland and Homeland Sexuals by Patricia Lockwood. I just came across this on Goodreads as a recommendation in poetry, and it is quite a new release, I believe. At least this print is a new release, and I'm very curious what I am going to think of it, because I read that other popular poetry book, which I can't as now find on my shelves, and I did really like it. I think it was Milk and Honey. It contained a few poems that I really liked, but I hope I will like all or most of the poems in this one. And as now I'm going on with the next 2 books I want to read, which are the second and third book in the Riftwar Saga. So the follow-up of Magician, which is Silverthorn, and the third book, which is called A Darkness at Sathanon. These books are actually quite old, and I'm hoping I like those 2 as much as Magician. And maybe that I will go on with the rest of the saga. I have to see the cycle, because the first 3 books are the Riftwar Saga, and then there is 27 follow-ups or something like that. There's 30 books, and that's called the Riftwar Cycle. And I'm very curious about those, but I am more curious about these first. And then we have the third book in the Southern Reach trilogy called Acceptance. And I just want to read this because I want to complete a trilogy. I have not a really big idea of what this is about anymore, except for that the people want to find out what the Southern Reach actually is, what Area X is. I don't know more, and I don't want to know more, because it is supposed to be a little bit of a mystery, or maybe a thrillerish thingy. So I want to keep my head as blank as possible about that, especially in this one, because it is the final book in the trilogy. And then the next book I want to read in the upcoming 2 months is a book that I also chose to read for Tome Tubble, but of course didn't, which is Wars of the Roses Stormbird by Con Eagledon. A historical fiction about the Wars of the Roses, the wars for the British thrones. This is also the wars that are part of the inspiration for the Lord, not the Lord of the Rings, what I want to say, but a Game of Thrones. And I thought maybe if I like historical fiction about that era and I know a little bit more about it, I will want to like reading a Game of Thrones. I actually do want to read them because they are classical fantasies, and fantasy is one of my favorite genres. But I just want to know more of the history first. And I thought that a historical fiction would be the obvious choice to go for. as I don't know where to find actual historical texts, and those are most of the time quite boring to me to read. So I chose for this book, which is part 1 in a 4-part book series called The Wars of the Roses, and every book has a different subtitle. Now we go on to the last pile of books. Book 1, or the first book that's left on the pile, is Centuries of June by Keith Donoghue. This sounds like an obvious June read because of Centuries of June. This is supposed to be a dark, humorous book, and I also believe, since all of his books are magical realism, this is an adult magical realism about a guy who died, and women tell about his past, and it is supposed to be dark, funny stories, and I'm really curious if that is true. I have been meaning to read this for more than 6 months. I have been having it in my bookshelves for a long time, so it's gonna be time that I read it, especially since I have another book on my TBR of his. But first we go on with a totally different book, which is Verfilm de Strips and Verstripte Films by Thomas Leeflang. This is a Dutch book about movies turned into comics and comics turned into movies. I got it as a free gift when I ordered another book, which is very interesting because I did not expect it, and I'm very curious what this book has to tell me about these kinds of things. I have lived through it a little bit, and it seems like a history kind of book, told in a funny way, hopefully. And I'm curious what I find in this. Then we have another Dutch book, which is a Dutch thriller, and I hope I won't hate it as much as Cici from Problems of a Book Nerd, because this is Oogwenk by Ted Dekker. He's a Christian writer, and Cici said that his books are very problematic and bad rap for Christians altogether, and just very, very racist and stuff. And I was curious to read it for my own before I jump on board with her opinion, because I think that's never a good idea. So I picked up not Blink, because of course she read the English version. I picked up the original Dutch version, and I hope it is not as bad as she said, but I think I trust her opinion. I just hope I enjoy reading this book. Then we have an originally English book translated into Dutch, because the author is originally Dutch. It takes place in Amsterdam. It's a YA sci-fi, and it's called Op de rand van het niets, or in English, On the Edge of Gone. And I'm very curious because it is written from the perspective of an autistic girl, and there is a meteor that's supposed to impact Earth, and I have autism too, so I'm curious if the rap in this book is a little bit like how I experience my autism, because of course everybody is different and experiences it differently. So I'm curious, and I want to tell you how it's done in this book. Then we end up with the last 2 books on my TBR for the upcoming 2 months. One is The Wish Granter, one of my last YA books on my shelf, and I'm trying to totally eradicate my YA bookshelf because I don't really enjoy reading the books that much most of the time, and I want to make space for like other books that I probably enjoy more. And this is The Wish Granter by C.J. Redwine, and it's, I believe, the second Ravenspire novel, but those books are companions, and this is a Rumpelstiltskin retelling, which is what appealed to me the most about it, because I did not hear any time earlier of a Rumpelstiltskin retelling, and I have read the first chapter of this, and you can absolutely get a Rumpelstiltskin vibe from this, which is done very well, and I hope I enjoy the book. And then we have the final book on my TBR for the May and June, which is The Motion of Puppets by Keith Donoghue. This book is the book he released last year, and I was very curious and apprehensive to buy it at first because it is a hardback and adult hardbacks are very, very expensive. But this is the story about a woman who comes by a puppet store every night for an extended period of time, or every day, but the thing is never open, and then one night she crosses paths with it and it's open. She goes in, and she gets missing. Apparently she turns into a puppet, which had me intrigued, and she and her husband need to find one another again so she can be turned into a human again. And I'm very curious what will happen in this book. Of course, it's also a magical realism. Like I said, Keith Donoghue writes adult magical realism as far as I know. So, and he is one of my favorite writers so far in English. I hope I really enjoy this book. And I think it will be a lot of fun. This was my wrap up and my TBR for this month. Today is a couple of extra videos because it is a Liberation Day in the Netherlands and I celebrate it with a couple of extra videos. But this is it for now. Until the next time and on keer!